He wasn't barking at the tree, he was begging it to breathe. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe some lives are saved not by chance, but by something greater, stay with me. The forest stretched quiet beneath a pale morning sky, the kind of stillness that settles deep into your bones, where even the wind seems to hold its breath. It was just past 0600 hours, somewhere along a forgotten stretch of state land in northern Idaho, where the pines grew tall and the ground stayed damp year-round, smelling of earth, moss, and old rain. Sergeant Caleb Ward moved steadily along the narrow trail, boots pressing softly into the needle-covered ground, each step measured, practiced, the rhythm of a man who had spent years learning how to listen more than he spoke. He wore a faded green field jacket despite the mild temperature, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the edge of ink along his right forearm, a black and gray tattoo of a German shepherd's face, eyes alert, almost alive in the filtered light. It wasn't decoration. It was memory. It was a promise. Just ahead of him, cutting through the quiet with a presence that felt both grounded and watchful, moved Ghost. The German shepherd's coat was a deep sable, darker along the spine, catching hints of silver where the light slipped through the trees. His ears stood tall, rotating with every distant sound, every shift in the air, his amber eyes scanning not just what was visible, but what wasn't. He didn't pull on the leash. He didn't lag behind. He moved like he belonged to the forest itself, as if he understood something Caleb didn't. This patrol wasn't supposed to be anything more than routine. A missing hiker had been reported 3 days earlier, a man in his late 50s who'd wandered off trail and never came back. Search teams had already covered most of the accessible ground. Caleb and Ghost were assigned the outer perimeter, the kind of assignment you give when you're not expecting much. Just a formality, just in case. The air carried the faint scent of pine sap and damp bark, layered with something colder underneath, something that didn't quite belong. Caleb noticed it, but not enough to stop. Not yet. Ghost did. About a mile in, without warning, Ghost slowed. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift, his gait tightening, his head lowering slightly, ears angling forward with intent. Caleb caught it immediately. Easy, he murmured, voice low, calm, more out of habit than concern. Ghost didn't respond. Another few steps. Then he stopped completely. The leash slackened between them as Ghost planted himself, body still, gaze locked ahead. Caleb followed his line of sight. At first, there was nothing unusual. Just trees. Tall, straight trunks rising from the forest floor, their bark darkened by moisture, patches of moss clinging like old scars. Then he saw it. About 20 yards ahead, on the side of a thick pine, there was a protrusion. A lump. Not large, maybe the size of a small duffel bag, bulging slightly from the trunk as if the tree had grown around something it shouldn't have. It didn't look right. Not like a natural knot. Not like a hive. It was too smooth in places, too irregular in others. The bark stretched thin over it like skin pulled tight. Ghost let out a low sound. Not a bark. Not yet. A vibration deep in his chest. Almost a warning. Almost a plea. Caleb felt it more than heard it. What is it? He said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. He took a step forward. Ghost didn't move. Instead, the low sound rose, breaking into a sharp, sudden bark that cut through the forest silence like a crack of thunder. Once. Twice. Then again, faster, louder, urgent. This wasn't alert behavior. This wasn't tracking. This was different. Caleb frowned, tightening his grip slightly on the leash. Ghost. Heel. The command came firm, controlled. Ghost didn't even glance back. He lunged forward a half step, stopped by the leash, and barked again. This time higher, edged with something that sounded dangerously close to panic. Caleb's jaw tightened. In 6 years of working together, Ghost had never ignored a direct command. Not once. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when something inside you starts shifting, when instinct begins to override protocol. All right, he muttered. All right, I hear you. He stepped closer, boots brushing through damp leaves, the smell intensifying now. Sap, rot, and something faintly metallic beneath it, subtle but unmistakable. Ghost pulled again, not aggressively, but insistently, his body angled toward the tree, tail rigid, every muscle engaged. As they approached, the forest seemed to narrow around them, the sounds of distant birds fading, replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. Caleb stopped a few feet from the trunk, eyes fixed on the strange growth. Up close, it looked even more unnatural. The bark wasn't just stretched, it was cracked in thin lines, as if something inside had pressed outward over time. There was moisture along the seams, dark and sticky, catching the light. Ghost's barking shifted again, dropping into a series of sharp, desperate bursts, then breaking into a soft, almost whimpering sound that made Caleb's chest tighten. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Caleb swallowed, his gaze tracing the contours of the lump, his mind running through possibilities. Animal carcass, hidden stash, some kind of environmental anomaly, but none of them fit. None of them explained Ghost. He reached out slowly, placing his gloved hand against the surface. It wasn't as hard as he expected. There was give to it. Slight, but there. And beneath his palm, something else. Not movement. Not exactly. But a faint, rhythmic pressure, so subtle he might have missed it if Ghost hadn't been losing his mind beside him. Caleb froze. The forest held its breath. And for the first time that morning, he realized whatever was inside that tree wasn't just there. It was still alive. Caleb did not pull his hand away, not immediately. Even as the sensation settled deeper into his awareness, subtle but undeniable, like a heartbeat muffled beneath layers of something not meant to hold it. He closed his eyes for half a second, steadying his breath, letting the world narrow down to that single point of contact, the damp bark against his glove, the faint pressure beneath it, the sound of Ghost behind him shifting from sharp barks into a strained, uneven whine that carried something close to urgency, something that felt less like warning and more like insistence. Okay, Caleb said under his breath, his voice quieter now, almost reverent, as if raising it might disturb whatever fragile thing existed inside that tree. I feel it too. Ghost moved closer, pressing against Caleb's side, his body tense, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on the exact spot where Caleb's hand rested. He let out a soft, broken sound, not quite a bark, not quite a cry, and then nudged Caleb's arm with his nose, once, firm but controlled, as if urging him forward, urging him not to hesitate. Caleb pulled his hand back slowly, his gaze sweeping over the surface again, noticing details he had missed before, the way the bark seemed to curve unnaturally around the mass, the thin seams where moisture gathered, the slight discoloration that hinted at something foreign beneath. He crouched down, lowering himself to Ghost's level, bringing his face closer to the tree, and the smell hit him stronger now, a mix of pine resin and something else, something warmer, almost organic, like breath caught in a closed space. He swallowed, his throat tightening, and glanced at Ghost. "You picked this up before I did, didn't you?" he murmured. Ghost's eyes flicked to him for just a moment, then back to the tree, unwavering, certain. Caleb nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, and reached behind his belt, pulling free a compact field knife, the blade catching a sliver of pale light as he turned it in his hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown, for the possibility that whatever lay inside was fragile in ways he could not yet see. "Easy," he whispered, angling the blade toward one of the natural cracks in the bark. The first touch was gentle, the tip of the knife pressing into the seam, testing resistance. The bark gave more easily than expected, the outer layer peeling back with a soft, damp sound, revealing a darker interior beneath, fibrous and uneven. Ghost's breathing quickened beside him, each inhale sharp, each exhale carrying a faint tremor. Caleb worked slowly, carefully widening the opening, using the knife more as a guide than a tool of force, prying rather than cutting, letting the structure of the wood dictate where it would give. A thin line opened, no more than a few inches, and from within came a subtle shift in the air, warmer, heavier, as if something long sealed was finally allowed to exhale. Caleb paused, leaning closer, his ear almost level with the opening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint and irregular, so soft it could have been imagined, came a sound. Not the creak of wood, not the rustle of insects. Something quieter. A breath. Ghost heard it too. His entire body stiffened, and he let out a low, vibrating whine that seemed to come from deep within his chest, a sound that carried recognition, relief, and something like urgency all at once. Caleb's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. "Hold on," he said softly, not sure who he was speaking to, the dog, himself, or whatever lay hidden inside. He widened the opening another inch, then another, peeling back layers of bark that seemed to have grown around something not meant to be there. The interior was not hollow in the way he expected. It was packed, but not with solid wood. There were spaces, pockets, irregular cavities that suggested something had been enclosed over time, slowly, almost deliberately. Caleb shifted his position, kneeling fully now, placing the knife aside for a moment as he used both hands to gently pull at the loosened bark. It came away in sections, damp and pliable, revealing more of the interior. And then he saw it. Not clearly at first, just a glimpse of something that did not belong to the tree, a different texture, smoother, wrapped in something that caught the light differently than whatever could. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, but he did not stop. He cleared more of the opening, his movements precise, controlled, guided by instinct, and something deeper he could not name. Ghost pressed closer, his nose reaching toward the gap, inhaling sharply, then letting out a soft, almost reverent sound. The space widened enough now for Caleb to see inside. Fabric, faded, damp, pressed tight against the inner walls of the tree, as if the trunk had grown around it, sealing it in place. Caleb's mind raced, pieces trying to fit. Together, none of them settling into anything that made sense. He reached in slowly, fingers brushing against the material, and felt warmth. Real warmth. Not residual heat, not the illusion of it, but something living, something present. He froze for a split second, the weight of that realization settling over him like a sudden drop in temperature. Then he moved again, more urgent now, but no less careful, pulling at the fabric, creating space, allowing air to flow into the cavity. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline that now coursed through him. Ghost's whine rose slightly, then softened, as if responding to Caleb's words, as if understanding that the moment they had been waiting for was finally unfolding. The forest remained silent around them. The world narrowed to the space between Caleb's hands and the hidden life within the tree, a fragile boundary between what had been lost and what might still be saved. Caleb shifted his grip, widening the opening just enough to slip his hand deeper inside, careful not to disturb whatever fragile balance had kept that warmth alive for so long. His fingers moving slowly through the confined space until they found the edge of the fabric again, damp and cold on the outside, but unmistakably warmer toward the center. And then something else, smaller, softer, not wood, not cloth. Something that yielded gently beneath his touch. He froze, breath catching, every instinct sharpening at once. Ghost let out a low, trembling sound, pressing closer, his nose almost inside the opening now, drawing in the scent with short, urgent breaths. Caleb swallowed hard, steadying himself. "Easy. I've got you," he whispered again, voice barely louder than the wind that did not seem to move. He adjusted his position, bracing one knee against the ground, leaning in just enough to see further into the cavity, his eyes straining against the dim interior until shapes began to form, contours separating from shadow. The fabric shifted slightly as he pulled it back, revealing more of what lay beneath, and then he saw it clearly for the first time. A small form, curled tightly within the hollow, wrapped in layers, that had once been protective but were now soaked and pressed thin by time. The outline unmistakable once his mind allowed itself to recognize it. Not an object, not debris, a child. For a brief second, everything inside him went still, the world narrowing to a single point where disbelief met reality. He did not pull away. He did not speak. He simply looked, taking in the details, the way the small chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven motions, the faint tremor of breath that had somehow continued in that impossible space. Ghost's whine softened into something almost like a sigh, his body lowering slightly as if in relief, as if he had known all along what waited there. Caleb's training returned in a quiet rush, not loud, not forceful, but present, guiding his hands, his breathing, his next decision. He moved with greater purpose now, though no less care, gently clearing more of the bark, widening the opening inch by inch until there was enough space to reach both hands inside. The interior walls of the tree were damp and uneven, pressing close, but there was just enough room. He slid one hand beneath the child's back, the other supporting the head, mindful of every movement, every shift in balance. The warmth was real. Fragile, but real. "You are okay," he murmured, the words coming without thought, shaped by instinct more than intention. "You are not alone anymore." Ghost stayed close, his head lowered, eyes fixed on the small figure, his breathing slow now, controlled, as if matching the rhythm he sensed within. Caleb paused for a moment before lifting, allowing a thin stream of fresh air to move into the hollow, watching for any change, any sign that the sudden exposure might overwhelm what had been preserved in that confined space. The child's chest rose slightly deeper this time, a faint, almost imperceptible response, but enough. Enough to tell him that time, somehow, had not run out. He exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and began to lift, easing the small body free from the grip of the tree. The fabric caught slightly on the rough edges, and he adjusted, angling carefully, never rushing, never forcing. Inch by inch, the form emerged, the layers peeling away from the bark, the space releasing what it had held. When the child was finally clear, Caleb brought them close to his chest, instinctively shielding them from the open air, his jacket shifting as he wrapped it gently around the small frame. The contrast was immediate, the forest air cooler against skin that had known only the enclosed warmth of the tree's interior. Ghost stepped in closer, his nose brushing lightly against the child's hand, then pausing, as if waiting for permission. Caleb watched, his heart steady but heavy with the weight of what had just happened, what was still happening. The child's fingers twitched faintly, a small movement, but undeniable. Ghost exhaled softly, his posture easing, tension leaving his body in a slow, visible release. Caleb adjusted his hold, supporting the head more securely, his eyes scanning quickly, not in panic, but in assessment, checking for responsiveness, for breath, for any sign that the fragile life in his arms was holding on. "Stay with me," he said quietly, his voice calm, grounded, carrying the same tone he had used in situations where steadiness mattered more than speed. The forest seemed to listen, the silence no longer empty but full, as if bearing witness to the moment. Caleb reached for his radio with one hand, careful not to shift the child too much, his thumb pressing the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Caleb Ward," he said, his voice low but clear, controlled despite the urgency beneath it. "I have located a survivor. Repeat, I have a live survivor. Approximate age, child. Condition is critical but stable. I need medical support at my coordinates immediately." There was a brief pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should, and then a response crackled back, sharp with surprise and focus. Caleb barely registered the words. His attention remained on the small figure in his arms, on the steady, fragile rise and fall beneath the layers of fabric and his jacket. Ghost stayed at his side, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of him, the quiet presence that had led them here, that had refused to let him walk past something the world had nearly hidden completely. Caleb glanced down at the tattoo on his right forearm, the inked eyes of the shepherd catching the light as his sleeve shifted, and then back at Ghost, who met his gaze for a brief second before returning his focus to the child. No words passed between them. None were needed. Caleb adjusted his stance, preparing to move, every step from here on carrying a different weight, a different meaning, as the forest slowly exhaled around them, releasing a secret it had held for far too long. Caleb moved carefully through the trees, each step deliberate, measured not by speed but by stability, his boots pressing into the damp forest floor as he adjusted his hold on the child, keeping them close to his chest where his body heat could offer some protection against the cool morning air. The weight was slight, far too light for what it should have been, and that alone tightened something deep inside him, but he did not let it reach his hands. His grip remained steady, supportive, practiced. Ghost stayed just ahead and slightly to the side, no longer pulling, no longer barking, but not relaxed either. His ears remained forward, his head low, scanning the path as if the responsibility had shifted but not ended. Every few seconds, he glanced back, eyes flicking from Caleb to the child, then forward again, maintaining a quiet, vigilant rhythm. The forest seemed different now. The silence was no longer empty or indifferent. It felt aware. The faint scent of pine still hung in the air, but beneath it lingered that warmer note, subtle, fragile, like the echo of breath that had been hidden for too long. Caleb adjusted his jacket around the child, tucking it tighter, ensuring the small face remained exposed enough for air, his eyes constantly checking for movement, for breath, for any sign that the fragile balance was holding. The rise and fall was still there. Shallow, uneven, but present. "Stay with me," he murmured again, the words low and steady, not rushed, not panicked, just consistent, as if the sound itself might anchor something that had nearly slipped away. The radio crackled faintly at his shoulder, dispatch confirming coordinates, voices overlapping in the background as units were redirected, medical teams mobilized, but Caleb let the noise fade into the edges of his awareness. Out here, there was only the path, the child, and the quiet presence of the dog who had refused to walk past what others had missed. A branch brushed against his sleeve as he moved, the soft scrape of it loud in the stillness, and Ghost paused for half a second, ears twitching, before continuing forward. The trail curved gently to the right, sloping downward toward a clearing that Caleb knew would open up within another quarter-mile. He calculated distance without thinking, time without checking, his pace steady but purposeful. Not running. Running would risk too much. He needed control more than speed. As they moved, the child's hand shifted again, a faint, reflexive movement that pressed lightly against Caleb's jacket. It was small, almost nothing, but it changed everything. Caleb felt it instantly, his breath catching just slightly before settling again into that controlled rhythm. "That is it," he whispered. "Keep going." Ghost noticed it too. His head turned sharply for a moment, eyes locking onto the small movement, and then something in his posture softened further, the tension easing just enough to reveal what lay beneath it. Not relief. Not yet. But hope. They reached the edge of the clearing just as the first distant sound broke through the forest's hold. Faint at first, barely more than a hum carried on the air, but growing, steady, unmistakable. Rotors. Caleb did not look up immediately. He focused on his footing as the terrain shifted from dense undergrowth to more open ground, patches of grass and low brush replacing the thick layer of needles. The sound grew louder, pressing down from above, stirring the tops of the trees before reaching the ground, sending a light whine through the clearing that brushed against Caleb's face and the child's exposed skin. He turned slightly, angling his body to shield them from the direct gust, tightening his hold without restricting movement. Ghost stepped closer now, no longer ranging ahead, but aligning himself with Caleb's stride, his body positioned protectively, eyes scanning the edges of the clearing as the noise intensified. The helicopter broke through the tree line a moment later, descending slowly, controlled, its presence filling the space with movement and sound that felt almost out of place after the stillness of the forest. Dust and loose debris lifted in small spirals around them, and Caleb lowered his head slightly, keeping his focus on the child, one hand adjusting the edge of his jacket again, ensuring nothing shifted too suddenly. Figures moved quickly from the aircraft, their outlines blurred at first by the motion and light, then sharpening as they approached, their steps precise, practiced, carrying equipment that caught the sunlight in brief flashes. Caleb did not rush toward them. He held his ground, waiting for them to reach him, maintaining the position he had established, the stability that had carried them this far. When they closed the distance, one of the medics slowed, hands raised slightly, voice calm, measured, matching Caleb's own tone. "You have got them," the medic said, eyes moving quickly but carefully over the child, assessing without overwhelming. Caleb nodded once, shifting just enough to allow access while still supporting the head and back. "Breathing is shallow but consistent," he said quietly. "Responsive to touch." The medic nodded, moving closer, hands steady, mirroring Caleb's care as they prepared to transfer the child. Ghost watched every movement, his body still, eyes sharp, as if memorizing each action, ensuring that what had been found would not be lost again. Caleb felt the moment of transition before it happened, that subtle shift when responsibility begins to pass from one set of hands to another, and he adjusted his grip one final time, supporting the child as the medic's hands took over, slow, synchronized, careful not to break the fragile rhythm that had been preserved against all odds. For a brief second, as the weight lifted from his arms, Caleb felt the absence, not empty, but significant, like the echo of something that had just changed shape. He did not step back immediately. He stayed close, eyes fixed on the child as they were secured, his breath steady, his presence grounded. Ghost remained at his side, his head slightly lowered now, ears relaxed for the first time since they had stopped at the tree. The forest stood behind them, quiet again, as if nothing had happened, as if it had not held a life hidden within its stillness. Caleb glanced once over his shoulder toward where the tree stood, unseen now beyond the line of trunks, and then back to the child, now in the care of others. He reached down without looking, his hand finding Ghost's head, resting there for a brief, silent moment, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur. No words, just contact, just acknowledgement. And in that small, quiet gesture, something unspoken settled between them, steady and certain, as the helicopter's roar rose again and the clearing filled with motion, carrying forward what had almost been left behind. The helicopter lifted slowly, its blades carving the air into a steady rhythm that faded inch by inch as it climbed above the tree line, carrying with it the fragile weight of something that had refused to disappear. Caleb stood in the clearing long after the sound began to dissolve into distance, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed on the space where the aircraft had been only seconds before. The wind it left behind settled gradually, brushing through the grass and low brush until the forest began to reclaim its silence, the kind that does not rush back, but returns in layers, patient and complete. Ghost remained beside him, no longer tense, no longer scanning with urgency, but not entirely at rest either. His ears shifted slowly, catching distant sounds that no longer mattered, his body grounded, as if the purpose that had driven him to that tree had finally reached its end. Caleb exhaled, a long, controlled breath that seemed to carry more than just air, his shoulders lowering slightly as the weight of the moment adjusted inside him. He looked down at Ghost, his hand still resting lightly against the dog's head, fingers brushing through the thick fur in a quiet, absent motion that needed no intention. "You knew," he said softly, not as a question, but as a recognition of something he could not fully explain. Ghost did not respond in any way that could be measured, but he leaned subtly into the touch, his eyes lifting for a brief second before returning to the forest, calm now, steady. Caleb let his hand fall, his gaze shifting back toward the direction they had come from, toward the place where the tree stood hidden among the others, indistinguishable now unless you knew exactly where to look. He took a step forward, then another, not out of necessity, but out of something quieter, something that felt unfinished. Ghost followed without hesitation, falling into place at his side as they moved back along the path, the forest receiving them once again, the ground soft beneath their boots and paws. The air felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, but changed in a way that did not need definition. As they walked, Caleb replayed the moments in his mind, not as a series of actions, but as sensations, the feel of the bark beneath his hand, the faint pressure that should not have been there, the sound that had barely existed and yet had been enough. He had seen things in his years that did not make sense at first glance, things that required explanation, analysis, structure. This was not one of them. This was something else, something that had asked to be found, not loudly, not obviously, but quietly, patiently, waiting for the one presence that would not ignore it. He glanced at Ghost again, studying the dog's movements, the steady rhythm of his gait, the calm that had replaced the urgency. There was no sign now of the behavior that had broken every rule they had trained under, no trace of the refusal, the insistence. It was as if that moment had existed outside of everything else, separate, complete, and now finished. "You do not miss things," Caleb said under his breath, a faint trace of something softer touching his voice, not quite a smile, not quite anything he would name. Ghost's tail moved once, a small, controlled motion, and then stilled again, his focus forward. They reached the point where the trail narrowed again, the canopy thickening overhead, filtering the light into thin, shifting patterns that moved across the ground like quiet signals. Caleb slowed slightly, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, but now every detail felt sharper, more defined, as if the forest itself had revealed a layer he had not seen before. He stopped for a moment, turning his head toward the direction of the tree, though it remained out of sight, hidden among countless others that stood just as tall, just as silent. For a brief second, he considered going back, standing there again, looking at it with the knowledge he now carried. But he did not. Some things, he understood, were not meant to be revisited in the same way. Some moments belonged exactly where they happened, held in place not by memory alone, but by the quiet understanding that they had already given what they were meant to give. Caleb adjusted his sleeve absent-mindedly, the edge of the tattoo on his right forearm catching his eye again, the inked outline of the shepherd's face staring back with that same steady intensity it had always held. He had gotten it years ago, after a mission that had left more questions than answers, a reminder of loyalty, of instinct, of the kind of connection that does not require words. Today, it felt different. Not changed, but deeper, as if something had been added to it without altering its shape. He let his arm fall naturally back to his side, his steps resuming, the path unfolding ahead in the same quiet way it always had. Ghost walked beside him, close but not touching, his presence constant, unspoken, understood. The forest closed around them once more, the sounds returning in subtle layers, a distant bird call, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft shift of wind moving through branches high above. Nothing announced what had happened. Nothing marked the place where a life had been hidden and then found. And yet, for Caleb, it was there in every step, in every breath, in the steady awareness that sometimes the difference between loss and survival is not strength or timing or even chance. Sometimes, it is simply a dog who refuses to walk away and a man who chooses to listen. They continued down the trail without speaking, without needing to, the rhythm of their movements settling into something familiar again, but not unchanged, never. Unchanged, as the morning carried on and the forest held its quiet, knowing silence. The trail stretched ahead in quiet certainty, the kind that did not demand attention but rewarded it, and Caleb followed it without urgency, his pace steady, his breathing even, the rhythm of his steps aligning once more with the natural cadence of the forest. Ghost remained at his side, no longer guiding, no longer pulling, but present in a way that felt deeper than before, as if something unspoken had settled between them, something that did not need reinforcement or acknowledgement to exist. The morning light shifted slowly through the canopy, breaking into fragments across the ground, illuminating patches of moss and fallen branches in a soft, muted glow that carried no hint of what had unfolded not far behind them. Caleb's mind did not race. It moved slowly, deliberately, returning to the moment at the tree not as a problem to solve, but as something to understand in a different way. He had spent years learning to trust training, to rely on patterns, procedures, things that could be measured and repeated. But this had not followed any pattern he knew. There had been no visible sign from a distance, no clear indication that anything was wrong, and yet Ghost had known. Not suspected, not guessed, known. Caleb glanced down at him again, watching the way the dog moved, the quiet confidence in each step, the absence of hesitation. There was no pride in it, no sense of accomplishment, just calm, as if what had happened was not extraordinary at all, but simply the result of paying attention in a way most beings had forgotten how to do. "You heard something I could not," Caleb said softly, his voice carrying no doubt, only recognition. Ghost's ear flicked slightly at the sound, but he did not break stride, his gaze forward, focused but no longer urgent. The path widened slightly as they moved, the forest opening just enough to allow a clearer view of the terrain ahead, the distant line of a service road visible through the trees, a reminder that the world beyond this quiet space still existed, still moved at its usual pace. Caleb slowed as they approached it, his eyes scanning the ground, the surroundings, not out of caution now, but out of habit, the ingrained awareness that had become second nature. Nothing seemed out of place. No sign that anything had shifted beyond what he carried within him. He stepped onto the edge of the road, gravel crunching softly beneath his boots, the sound sharper than anything in the forest, almost jarring in its clarity. Ghost paused for a brief second, looking out over the open stretch, then back at Caleb, as if checking in, as if confirming that this was the direction they were meant to go. Caleb nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and Ghost moved forward again, crossing onto the road beside him. The air felt different here, less dense, less layered, carrying the faint scent of dust, and sun-warmed earth instead of damp bark and moss. Caleb took a slow breath, letting it settle, then released it just as steadily. For a moment, he allowed himself to stand still, to feel the shift, to recognize the boundary between where they had been and where they were now. It was not a line anyone else would see. There was no marker, no sign. But for him, it was clear. He reached down again, his hand finding Ghost's head, fingers pressing gently behind the ears, a quiet gesture of connection that needed no explanation. Ghost leaned into it slightly, his eyes softening for just a second before returning to their usual alert calm. Caleb's gaze drifted back toward the forest, toward the unseen place where the tree stood, holding its silence as it always had, offering no indication of what it had carried, what it had released. He wondered, briefly, how many other things existed like that, hidden in plain sight, waiting not for someone stronger or faster, but for someone willing to notice, to pause, to listen to something that did not speak in words. He did not dwell on it. Some questions were not meant to be answered fully. Some were meant to remain open, a quiet space in the mind that kept a person aware of what they might otherwise miss. A distant vehicle's sound broke through the stillness, faint at first, then growing as it approached along the road, a reminder that the rest of the world had continued moving. While they had stood in that moment between what was seen and what was hidden, Caleb turned slightly, acknowledging it without focus, then looked back at Ghost. "We are heading back," he said, his voice steady, grounded in the present again. Ghost responded with a small shift in posture, aligning himself more closely with Caleb's path, ready to move without question. They began walking along the road, the gravel crunching beneath each step, the sound consistent, grounding, real. The forest remained to their side, stretching endlessly, its depths unchanged, its silence intact. Caleb did not look back again. He did not need to. What had happened was not behind him in the way distance suggests. It had settled into him, into the quiet places where experience becomes something more than memory. As they walked, the sun rose higher, its light growing stronger, casting longer shadows that slowly shortened with each passing minute. The day moved forward, as it always did, indifferent to the moments that defined it for those who lived within it. But for Caleb and for Ghost, something had shifted in a way that would not fade with the passing of time. It was not dramatic. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed, steady and certain, like the quiet understanding that sometimes the smallest signal, the faintest sound, the slightest refusal to move on, can carry the weight of a life waiting to be found. And as they continued down that road, side by side, there was no need to speak it aloud. It was already there, in every step, in every breath, in the unspoken bond that had just proven itself once again, not through command or training, but through something deeper, something that could not be taught, only trusted. The road curved gently ahead, bending out of sight where the trees thickened again, and Caleb followed it without hesitation, his stride even, his shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been earlier that morning. The sun had climbed higher now, casting a warmer light across the gravel, turning each small stone into a brief reflection that flickered underfoot. Ghost moved beside him, close but not touching, his presence steady, his breathing calm. The urgency that had once defined his movements replaced by something quieter, something settled. For a while, neither of them made a sound beyond the natural rhythm of walking, the soft crunch of boots and paws blending into the low hum of the day beginning around them. In the distance, a bird called once, then again, its voice clear and unhurried, as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not just shifted in a way only a few would ever know. Caleb let the sound pass through him, not focusing on it, not pushing it away, simply allowing it to exist alongside everything else. His thoughts returned, not as questions now, but as quiet reflections, the kind that do not demand answers but stay with you long after the moment has passed. He thought about the tree, about the way it had stood among countless others, offering no sign, no warning, no visible reason to stop. He thought about how easily he could have walked past it, how close that moment had come to never happening at all. And then he looked at Ghost again, really looked, taking in the details that had always been there, but now seemed sharper, more defined, as if the morning had changed not the dog, but the way he saw him. "You did not hesitate," Caleb said softly, his voice carrying just enough weight to acknowledge what had been done without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. Ghost's ears flicked at the sound, his head turning slightly toward Caleb before returning forward, his expression unchanged, calm, focused, present. Caleb let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite anything he would name, and shook his head once, more out of quiet disbelief than anything else. They continued down the road until the outline of a parked vehicle came into view, partially shaded beneath a cluster of trees, its dark frame blending into the surroundings in a way that made it easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. Caleb angled toward it, his steps slowing slightly as they approached, the routine of returning settling in around him like a familiar coat. He reached the vehicle and paused beside it, one hand resting briefly against the side, feeling the residual warmth from the rising sun against the metal. Ghost circled once, then sat near the rear tire, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if waiting for the next instruction that did not come immediately. Caleb opened the back door, the hinge creaking softly in the quiet air, and reached inside for a canteen, unscrewing the cap with a practiced motion before taking a slow drink. The water was cool, grounding real. He lowered it and held it out slightly, and Ghost stood, stepping forward to drink as well, his movements controlled, unhurried, as if the urgency of earlier had never existed. Caleb watched him for a moment, the simple act carrying more meaning now than it would have any other day. When Ghost finished, he stepped back, settling again beside the vehicle, his eyes lifting briefly to meet Caleb's before drifting toward the forest line. Caleb capped the canteen and set it back inside, then leaned lightly against the door, his gaze following Ghost for a moment, tracing the edge of the trees where shadows still lingered despite the growing light. "They will make it," he said quietly, not as a statement of fact he could prove, but as something he chose to believe, something that felt right in a way that did not need confirmation. Ghost did not respond, but his ears shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the sound, the tone, the intention behind the words. Caleb pushed off from the door and closed it gently, the sound soft but definitive, marking the end of something and the beginning of whatever came next. He walked around to the driver's side, opening the door and pausing for a brief second before getting in, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes once more drifting toward the forest. There was nothing there to see. No movement, no sign, no indication of what had happened beyond what he already carried within him. And yet, it did not feel empty. It felt complete. He slid into the seat and reached over, opening the rear door slightly so Ghost could climb in. The dog did so without hesitation, settling into his usual place with a quiet shift of weight, his body aligning with the space as if it had always belonged there. Caleb closed the door and started the engine, the low hum, filling the air, different from the silence, but not disruptive, just another layer in the soundscape of the day. He rested his hands on the wheel for a moment before moving, his eyes forward now, focused on the road ahead. As the vehicle began to roll, gravel crunching beneath the tires, Caleb felt something settle inside him, not a conclusion, not an ending, but a quiet certainty. He did not need to explain what had happened. He did not need to define it. It existed as it was, complete in its own way, carried forward not in words, but in understanding. Ghost shifted slightly in the back, adjusting his position, then grew still again, his presence steady, familiar, unchanged, and yet somehow deeper than before. The road stretched out ahead, the trees passing by in a steady rhythm, the light continuing to shift as the day moved forward. And somewhere behind them, unseen and unmarked, stood a tree that had once held a life in silence, waiting for the one voice that could hear it. Caleb did not look back. He did not need to. Some moments are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be carried, quietly, in the space between what we see and what we choose to listen to. The vehicle rolled steadily along the narrow road, tires pressing into gravel with a consistent rhythm that felt almost meditative, each turn of the wheel carrying them farther from the place where the forest had revealed something it usually kept hidden. Caleb kept his eyes forward, hands firm but relaxed on the steering wheel, his posture composed, grounded in the familiar motion of driving. The sunlight filtered through the windshield in shifting bands, warming the dashboard, casting faint reflections across the glass that moved with each passing tree. Ghost lay in the back seat, his body stretched along the worn fabric, head resting low but not fully relaxed, his ears still attentive to the world beyond the vehicle, catching distant sounds through the partially open window where fresh air moved in soft currents. The scent of pine lingered, faint now, blending with the neutral smell of the interior, a quiet reminder of where they had been only minutes ago. Caleb drove in silence, not the empty kind, but the kind that holds something, the kind that does not need to be filled. His thoughts returned again, not to analyze, not to question, but to settle into understanding. The image of the tree came back to him, not as a visual alone, but as a feeling, the moment his hand had touched the bark and recognized something that should not have been there, something that had no reason to exist, and yet did. He tightened his grip on the wheel just slightly, then released it, letting his hands return to their natural position. "You felt it before I did," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not break the stillness, just moved within it. Ghost shifted slightly in the back, lifting his head for a brief second, his eyes meeting Caleb's reflection in the rearview mirror before settling again. Calm, steady, present. Caleb allowed a small breath to leave him, not heavy, not strained, just enough to acknowledge what had been said. The road stretched ahead, leading toward the main access route where the forest would give way to open land, to buildings, to people who would ask questions, who would need answers, who would try to place what had happened into something structured, something that could be written down, recorded, explained. Caleb knew that part would come. He knew he would have to speak, to describe, to recount the sequence of events in a way that others could understand. But he also knew that there would be a part of it that would not translate, a part that existed outside of language, outside of report forms and official statements. A part that belonged only to the moment itself. He slowed slightly as the road widened, approaching a junction where a faded sign marked the boundary of the search area. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to patches of open ground where sunlight spread more freely, warming the earth in a way the dense canopy had not allowed. Caleb guided the vehicle onto the broader path, the transition smooth, controlled, the sound of gravel shifting to a more compact surface beneath the tires. In the distance, a cluster of vehicles came into view, parked along the edge of a clearing, their shapes familiar, their presence signaling the return to structure, to coordination, to the part of the world where things were named and organized. He slowed further as he approached, bringing the vehicle to a gradual stop near the outer edge, leaving space between himself and the others. The engine idled softly for a moment before he turned it off, the sudden quiet settling around them like a gentle weight. Caleb sat still for a second, his hands resting on the wheel, his gaze forward, not focused on any one thing, but on everything at once. Ghost remained in the back, watching, waiting, his presence unchanged. Caleb opened the door and stepped out, the air outside warmer now, carrying faint sounds of voices, movement, radios, the distant hum of activity that had resumed its normal pace. He walked around the vehicle and opened the rear door, stepping back slightly to give Ghost space. The dog rose smoothly, stepping down onto the ground with quiet confidence, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes scanning the area briefly before settling back on Caleb. For a moment, they stood there, side by side, the world around them moving, speaking, organizing, while they remained still, grounded in something that did not need to be explained. Caleb reached down once more, his hand resting against Ghost's head, fingers pressing gently into the fur, a gesture that had become instinctive, natural, necessary. "They are going to ask how we found them," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying no tension, only awareness. Ghost's ear flicked slightly, his gaze steady. Caleb nodded once, as if answering his own thought. "I will tell them the truth," he continued, his tone calm, certain. He let his hand fall, straightening as he turned toward the others, the part of the day that required words, structure, and explanation now waiting for him. But even as he took that first step forward, even as voices called out and movement shifted toward him, there was a quiet certainty beneath it all, something that would not be altered by questions or reports or explanations. Because some things are not understood by breaking them down, by measuring them, by fitting them into what we already know. Some things are understood by standing still long enough to notice what others walk past, by trusting the signal that does not come in words, by listening to the one presence that refuses to ignore it. And as Caleb moved forward into the waiting world, Ghost at his side, that understanding remained, steady and unshaken, carried not in what he would say, but in what he had already learned without needing to be told. Voices reached him before faces did, layered and overlapping, questions forming before they were fully asked, but Caleb did not rush to answer them, did not let the movement pull him faster than he was already going. He walked at the same steady pace, Ghost beside him, until the distance closed and the figures around him came into focus, uniforms, radios, eyes that searched for clarity in a situation that had already moved beyond what most of them expected. Someone stepped forward, a man with a clipboard in one hand and concern written clearly across his face, his voice controlled but edged with urgency. "Sergeant Ward, we heard you found a survivor," he said, not waiting long enough for a response before continuing. "Can you confirm condition, location, how you made contact?" Caleb met his gaze, calm, composed, his breathing even. The weight of the moment settled, but not heavy. "The child is alive," he said first, his voice steady, grounded in what mattered most. "Breathing was shallow but consistent when we made contact. Responsive to touch." The man nodded quickly, already noting it down, his pen moving across the page with practiced efficiency. "And the location?" he asked. Caleb paused for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not as simple as coordinates alone. "About 1 mile inside the northern sector," he said. "Off the marked trail." That much fit easily into the structure they needed. But the next part did not. The man looked up again, waiting. "How did you find them?" he asked, the question direct, expected, necessary. Caleb glanced briefly at Ghost, then back at the man. There was no hesitation in his expression, no uncertainty, just a quiet decision. "My dog alerted," he said. The words were simple, clear, and true. The man's eyes shifted to Ghost, taking in the German shepherd's calm stance, the steady presence that did not match the intensity of what had just been described. "Alerted to what?" the man pressed. Caleb held his gaze, not defensive, not evasive, just steady. "Something that did not belong," he replied. It was the closest thing to an explanation that still felt honest. The man nodded again, though this time slower, as if processing something that did not fit neatly into the lines he was writing. "And the child was where exactly?" Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, not from discomfort, but from the weight of the memory. "Inside a tree," he said. The words landed quietly, but they shifted the air around them. For a brief second, no one spoke. The man blinked once, then twice, as if making sure he had heard correctly. "Inside a tree?" he repeated. Caleb nodded once. "Encased within the trunk," he clarified, his tone calm, measured. "Alive." The man looked down at his clipboard, then back up, the pen in his hand momentarily still. Around them, a few others had paused, their attention drawn not by the volume of the conversation, but by its content. Caleb did not elaborate further. He did not add details that would only complicate what needed to be understood. He had said enough. The man cleared his throat lightly, regaining his professional rhythm, his pen moving again, though slower now. "We will need a full report," he said, almost automatically. Caleb nodded. "You will have it." There was no resistance in his voice, no reluctance, just acknowledgement. Ghost remained at his side, unmoving, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady, as if the conversation happening around him existed on a different level, one that did not require his involvement. A radio crackled nearby, voices exchanging updates, coordinates, confirmations, the system continuing to function, to organize, to respond. Caleb listened without focusing, letting the sounds pass through him. The man with the clipboard stepped back slightly, signaling the end of the immediate exchange, his attention already shifting to the next task, the next detail that needed to be managed. Caleb stood there for a moment longer, the movement around him continuing, people passing, voices rising and falling, the rhythm of coordination filling the space. He felt none of the urgency now, only a quiet awareness, a steady presence that had replaced it. He looked down at Ghost again, studying him not as a tool, not as an asset, but as something else entirely, something that had bridged a gap no one else had even seen. "They are going to write it down," Caleb said softly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between them. "They're going to try to explain it." Ghost's ear flicked slightly, his head turning just enough to acknowledge the sound, then stilling again. Caleb allowed a small breath to leave him, his gaze lifting toward the forest line in the distance. "They will not get it all," he added, not as criticism, not as doubt, but as simple fact. Some things did not translate. Some things were not meant to. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance, his eyes moving across the clearing, taking in the scene, the vehicles, the people, the structure that had returned. It all looked the same as it always had. And yet, for him, it was not. He reached down once more, his hand resting briefly on Ghost's head, the gesture familiar now, grounding. No words followed. None were needed. Because what had happened did not require validation, did not require confirmation beyond what he had already witnessed, what he had already felt. It existed in the quiet space between what could be recorded and what could only be remembered. And as the day moved forward, as reports would be written and questions would be answered, that space remained untouched, steady, carrying the truth in a way no document ever could. The questions did not stop, they simply changed shape, moving from urgent to structured, from immediate to reflective, and Caleb answered only what was necessary, no more, no less, his voice steady, his tone even, each word placed with intention, as if anything beyond that might disturb something that was better left undisturbed. Time passed in a way that felt both slow and immediate, minutes folding into each other as reports were requested, coordinates confirmed, timelines reconstructed in careful sequences that could be written down and understood by those who had not been there. Ghost remained close, never straying far, his presence constant but unobtrusive, as if he understood that his part in this had already been completed, and now it was Caleb's turn to carry the weight in a different way. Eventually, the movement around them shifted again, not with urgency this time, but with resolution, the kind that comes when the unknown has been replaced by something solid, something that can be accounted for. A second vehicle arrived, its tires crunching softly as it pulled into the clearing, and from it stepped a woman in a light jacket, her face drawn with a kind of restrained tension that did not need explanation. She moved quickly, but not chaotically, her steps controlled, her eyes scanning the area until they settled on Caleb. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where everything else seemed to fade slightly, the noise lowering, the movement slowing, as if the space itself recognized the shift in purpose. Caleb straightened slightly as she approached, his posture instinctively adjusting, not formal, not rigid, but aware. She stopped a few feet in front of him, her breath catching just enough to be visible, her eyes searching his face for something she could hold on to. "You found them," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had not yet lifted. Caleb nodded once. "We did," he replied. The word was deliberate. "Not I. Not alone." Her gaze flicked briefly to Ghost, taking in the dog with a kind of quiet recognition, then back to Caleb. "Are they?" she began, the rest of the question unable to form fully. "Alive," Caleb said gently, his tone firm in its certainty. "They were breathing when we made contact." Medical team took over immediately. The woman closed her eyes for a brief second, her shoulders lowering just slightly, not fully relaxed, but no longer held as tightly as before. When she opened them again, there was something different there, not relief exactly, but the beginning of it. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, but carrying more than they needed to. Caleb did not respond. Immediately, he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gratitude without absorbing it, without letting it settle in a way that shifted the truth of what had happened. "You should head to the hospital," he said instead, his voice calm, guiding rather than directing. "They will have more information soon." She nodded, already turning slightly, her focus shifting toward what came next, but before she moved away completely, she paused, looking once more at Ghost. For a moment, she did not speak, as if unsure how to address something she did not fully understand. Then, quietly, almost as if speaking to both of them at once, she said, "He did not give up, did he?" Caleb glanced down at Ghost, then back at her. "No," he said. "He did not." She held that for a second, then nodded again, more firmly this time, and turned away, moving toward the vehicle that had brought her, the next part of her journey already unfolding. Caleb watched her go for a moment, then let his gaze fall back to Ghost, who stood exactly where he had been, steady, quiet, present. The clearing continued to move around them, people returning to tasks, conversations resuming, the structure reasserting itself now that the uncertainty had been reduced. Caleb reached down once more, his hand finding Ghost's head, resting there with a familiarity that no longer felt like a gesture, but like a necessity, a grounding point in a moment that had already begun to shift into memory. "They will remember today," Caleb said softly, his voice low, meant only for the space between them. Ghost's ear flicked slightly, his eyes lifting for a brief second, then settling again. Caleb exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting toward the horizon, where the forest line met the open sky, the boundary between what was hidden and what was seen. "But they will not remember it the way we do," he added, not with sadness, not with regret, but with understanding. Some moments were not meant to be shared in full. Some were meant to be carried quietly, held in the space where words could not reach. He let his hand fall, straightening as he looked around the clearing one last time, taking in the movement, the structure, the return to normal that had already begun. Nothing here would reflect what had happened in the forest. Not really. And that was fine. Because what mattered had already been carried forward, not in reports, not in explanations, but in something far simpler, far quieter. Caleb turned slightly, his body aligning with the direction of his vehicle, his next steps already forming without urgency. Ghost moved with him immediately, falling into place at his side, his presence unchanged, steady, constant. Together, they began to walk, leaving behind the noise, the questions, the structure, not in rejection, but in quiet completion. And as they moved, there was no need to speak what had already been proven, no need to define what had already been understood. Because sometimes, the truth does not arrive in words, or in evidence, or in anything that can be written down. Sometimes, it arrives in the form of a quiet refusal, a bark that does not stop, a presence that does not walk away, until something hidden is finally seen. The clearing gradually emptied as the hours passed, vehicles leaving one by one, voices fading into distance, until what remained was only the quiet residue of what had happened, a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. Caleb stood near the edge of it, just far enough from the center that the movement no longer touched him, his posture relaxed, his gaze drifting without urgency across the open space where everything had unfolded in the language of structure and response. Ghost remained beside him, seated now, his body at ease, his breathing slow, as if the weight he had carried earlier had finally settled into something lighter, something complete. The sun had climbed higher, casting a warmer light across the ground, turning the clearing into something almost ordinary again, a place that no longer hinted at the urgency it had held just a short time ago. Caleb shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, his eyes tracing the line where the clearing met the forest, that quiet boundary that seemed unchanged to anyone who had not crossed it with purpose. For him, it held something different now, something that could not be seen but could not be ignored. He reached down, his hand resting lightly on Ghost's head, fingers moving in a slow, absent rhythm that spoke more of thought than intention. "It is already becoming a story," he said quietly, his voice low, reflective, shaped by the awareness of how quickly moments like this moved from reality into retelling. Ghost did not respond, but he did not need to. Caleb let his hand remain there for a moment longer, then withdrew it, straightening as he took a slow breath. He turned slightly, his gaze moving toward his vehicle, still parked at the edge of the clearing, its presence simple, grounded, unchanged. The world had not shifted for it. Machines rarely did. They remained as they were, unaffected by the quiet transformations that happened within the people who used them. Caleb began to walk, his steps unhurried, the gravel beneath his boots sounding softer now, less intrusive, as if even that had adjusted to the new pace of the moment. Ghost rose immediately, falling into step beside him, his movement smooth, effortless, as if the connection between them required no signal, no command, only presence. They reached the vehicle without pause, Caleb opening the door with a practiced motion, his hand lingering for a brief second on the handle before he stepped inside. Ghost followed, climbing into the back seat and settling down in one fluid movement, his body aligning with the space as naturally as before. Caleb closed the door and sat for a moment without starting the engine, his hands resting on the wheel, his gaze forward but unfocused, as if allowing the last pieces of the morning to settle into place. The silence inside the vehicle was different from the silence of the forest, contained, shaped, but no less real. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward and turned the key. The engine responded with a low, steady hum, grounding, familiar. He did not move immediately. Instead, he looked into the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Ghost's for a brief second. There was no question there, no expectation, only recognition. Caleb nodded once, a small, quiet gesture that carried everything that did not need to be spoken. He shifted the vehicle into gear and began to drive, the tires rolling forward with a soft, consistent sound, the clearing receding behind them without ceremony. The road ahead stretched out in a long, gentle line, bordered by trees that no longer seemed quite as silent as they had before. Caleb drove without urgency, his movements smooth, controlled, each turn of the wheel deliberate but unforced. The sunlight moved across the windshield, warming the interior, casting soft reflections that shifted with the motion of the car. Ghost remained still in the back, his presence steady, his breathing even, as if the rhythm of the drive matched something internal, something settled. As the miles passed, the landscape began to change, the dense forest giving way to more open ground, fields appearing between clusters of trees, the horizon widening in a way that felt almost symbolic, though Caleb did not dwell on it. He let the road carry him forward, his thoughts no longer circling, no longer searching, simply existing alongside the movement. After a while, he spoke again, not loudly, not as a statement meant to be heard beyond the space they shared. "You did what you were supposed to do," he said, his voice calm, steady, but carrying a depth that went beyond the words themselves. Ghost's ear flicked slightly at the sound, his head lifting just enough to acknowledge it before settling again. Caleb allowed a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression, something softer than what he usually allowed himself, something that did not need to be held back in this moment. "Maybe more than that," he added quietly. The road continued to unfold ahead of them, the world returning to its usual patterns, cars in the distance, the faint outline of buildings appearing as they moved closer to town, the structure of everyday life reasserting itself without question. And yet, beneath it all, there was something that remained untouched by that return, something that had been altered in a way that would not revert, would not fade with time. Caleb drove on, his posture steady, his gaze forward, the quiet understanding of what had happened settling deeper with each mile, not as something extraordinary, not as something to be explained or repeated, but as something simple, something true. Because in the end, it had not been about the tree, or the search, or even the outcome. It had been about a moment when one being refused to ignore what could not be seen, and another chose to trust that refusal, to follow it without needing to understand it first. And sometimes, that is all it takes. Not certainty, not proof, just the willingness to listen when something in the silence insists that you should not walk away. The town came into view slowly, not all at once, but in layers, a gas station first, then a row of low buildings, then the familiar outline of the hospital rising beyond them, its white exterior catching the afternoon light in a way that made it stand apart from everything else. Caleb eased off the accelerator, letting the vehicle slow naturally as he approached the intersection, the sound of tires shifting from rough gravel to smooth asphalt marking the transition from the quiet of the forest to the structure of the world beyond it. Traffic was light, a few cars moving through their routines, unaware of what had unfolded just miles away, unaware of how close something had come to being lost entirely. Ghost shifted slightly in the back seat as the vehicle slowed, lifting his head just enough to take in the new surroundings, his ears adjusting to the different rhythm of sound, engines, distant voices, the subtle hum of a place that never truly stood still. Caleb glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, their eyes meeting for a second before he looked forward again, guiding the vehicle through the intersection and onto the road that led directly to the hospital. He did not rush. There was no need now. The urgency had passed, replaced by something quieter, something that did not demand speed but presence. The hospital parking lot was partially full, Rows of vehicles lined in careful order, their arrangement precise, predictable. Caleb pulled into a space near the far end, away from the main entrance, and turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the vehicle felt heavier here, not oppressive, but full, as if it carried the echo of everything that had led them to this point. He sat still for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, eyes forward, allowing himself that pause before stepping into what came next. Then he opened the door and stepped out, the air warmer here, carrying the faint scent of pavement and distant greenery, a contrast to the damp, layered smell of the forest. He walked around to the back and opened the door, stepping aside as Ghost climbed down, landing softly on the asphalt, his posture steady, alert but calm. Together, they moved toward the entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a quiet mechanical sound that felt almost too clean, too controlled after the raw stillness of the woods. Inside, the lighting shifted, bright, even, the air cooler, filtered, carrying the sterile scent of antiseptic and something else beneath it, something human, something fragile. Voices echoed softly in the hallway, footsteps passing, monitors beeping in distant rooms, each sound precise, measured, part of a system designed to respond, to restore, to hold on to what could still be held. Caleb approached the front desk, his movements direct but unhurried, his presence drawing attention without demanding it. The woman behind the desk looked up, her expression shifting from routine to recognition as she took in his uniform, the dog at his side, the quiet weight he carried. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professional but gentle. Caleb nodded once. "We were part of the search this morning," he said. "The child brought in from the northern sector." The woman's expression softened slightly, understanding settling in. "They are in care," she said. "Stable." The word landed quietly, but it carried more than its definition. Caleb inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it, feeling something within him settle just a little more firmly. "Is family here?" he asked. She nodded. "They are with the doctors now." Caleb did not ask for more. He did not need details, not yet. He stepped back slightly, moving to the side of the hallway where he could stand without being in the way, without interrupting the flow of movement that continued around him. Ghost stayed close, his presence steady, his posture calm, his eyes observing without intrusion. Time moved. Differently here, measured in minutes, in updates, in small changes that carried weight. Caleb stood quietly, his gaze occasionally shifting toward the hallway that led deeper into the hospital, where doors opened and closed, where lives intersected in ways that could not always be predicted. He did not expect anything. He did not wait for acknowledgement or recognition. He simply stood, present, grounded, allowing the moment to unfold as it would. After a while, footsteps approached, slower this time, more deliberate, and the woman from the clearing appeared again, her face different now, not free of tension, but no longer held by it in the same way. When she saw Caleb, she paused, then walked toward him, her steps steady, her eyes clearer. "They are going to be okay," she said, the words coming with a quiet certainty that did not need emphasis. Caleb nodded once, the confirmation settling into him without resistance. "That is good," he replied simply. She looked down briefly at Ghost, then back at Caleb, something unspoken passing through her expression, something that did not need to be named. "They asked how it happened," she said softly. Caleb met her gaze. "What did you tell them?" he asked. She hesitated for just a second, then allowed a faint, almost incredulous breath to leave her. "I told them a dog would not stop barking," she said. Caleb's expression did not change, but something behind it did, something that recognized the truth in its simplest form. He nodded once. "That is enough," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded in return, turning back toward the hallway where her next steps would take her. Caleb remained where he was, Ghost beside him, the quiet of the hospital settling around them in a different way than the forest had, but no less meaningful. He looked down at the dog, his hand resting briefly on his head once more, not as a gesture, not as a habit, but as something that had become part of the way he understood the world now. And in that quiet space, with the steady rhythm of life continuing around them, there was no need for explanation, no need for anything beyond what had already been done, already been proven, already been carried forward. The hallway quieted as the afternoon stretched toward evening, the light outside softening into a warmer tone that filtered gently through the high windows, casting long, quiet reflections across the polished floor. Caleb remained where he stood, not out of obligation, not because anyone had asked him to stay, but because something in him understood that leaving too soon would feel incomplete, like stepping away before a story had finished telling itself. Ghost stayed close at his side, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow and even, the tension from earlier now fully gone, replaced by a calm that felt earned rather than assumed. The sounds of the hospital continued around them in steady rhythm, footsteps passing, voices low and measured, the distant beeping of monitors marking time in a way that felt both clinical and deeply human. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving once more toward the hallway where the child had been taken, though he made no move to approach it. He did not need to see more. He had seen enough. After a while, a nurse approached, her steps quiet, her expression soft but attentive, as if she understood that whatever had happened extended beyond what could be written in a chart. She stopped a few feet from Caleb, offering a small, respectful nod. "They are resting now," she said gently. "Doctors say it is going to take time, but they are responding well." Caleb inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words without drawing attention to himself. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, steady. The nurse's eyes moved briefly to Ghost, taking in the dog with a kind of quiet curiosity, then back to Caleb. "Animals like him," she said softly, almost to herself. "They notice things we do not." Caleb did not respond immediately. He looked down at Ghost, his hand resting once more on the dog's head, fingers pressing lightly into the fur in a familiar, grounding motion. "Sometimes," he said after a moment, "they do more than notice." The nurse held his gaze for a second, then nodded, as if she understood more than she was saying, before stepping away, her presence dissolving back into the flow of the hospital. Caleb remained still, the quiet settling around him once again, not empty, not waiting, but complete. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the final tension of the day releasing in a way that did not need to be seen to be real. Ghost shifted beside him, stepping closer until his shoulder brushed lightly against Caleb's leg, a small, simple contact that carried more meaning than anything spoken. Caleb glanced down, the corner of his expression softening just enough to register what he felt without needing to define it. "You stayed," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ghost's ears moved slightly, his eyes lifting for a brief second before settling again, calm, steady, present. Caleb allowed his hand to remain where it was, the connection unbroken, the moment unforced. After a while, he straightened, the decision to leave forming quietly, naturally, without urgency or reluctance. He turned toward the exit, his steps measured, his pace unchanged, Ghost moving with him as he always had, without command, without hesitation. They passed through the hallway, through the automatic doors, and back into the open air, where the light had softened further, the sky shifting toward evening in a way that made everything feel quieter, more settled. The parking lot stretched out before them, unchanged, ordinary, holding no sign of what had unfolded within the walls behind them. Caleb walked toward his vehicle, each step steady, grounded, the sound of his boots against the pavement clear but unintrusive. He opened the door, pausing for just a second before stepping in, Ghost following and settling into the back seat as naturally as before. Caleb closed the door and sat for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze forward, but his thoughts not moving, not searching, simply present. He did not replay the day again. He did not need to. What had happened had already found its place within him, not as something to analyze, not as something to question, but as something to carry, quietly, without effort. He started the engine, the low hum filling the space, grounding him once more in the simple, steady reality of the moment. As he pulled out of the parking space and onto the road, the hospital receding behind him, there was no sense of finality, no dramatic closing, just a quiet continuation, the kind that does not announce itself. The road ahead stretched out, familiar, predictable, the world returning to its usual rhythm, cars passing, lights changing, life moving forward in the way it always does. And yet, beneath that surface, something remained, something that would not fade, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was true. Caleb drove in